April 24th, 1908. Imagine, a machine that weighs 400 tons. It is a beast of iron and steam, a locomotive, thundering down the tracks of Mississippi. Inside, there are farmers, businessmen, mothers holding their children. They are safe. They are surrounded by steel walls, traveling on a schedule that has not changed in years. It is 2:35 in the afternoon. The conductor checks his watch. He is on time. He looks out the window at the passing pine trees. It is raining, hard. The sky is a strange color, a bruised, dark purple. But the train pushes on, because trains do not stop for rain. Suddenly, the sound of the engine changes. It is not the rhythmic chugging of the wheels anymore. It is drowned out by a roar so loud, so deep, that the passengers feel it in their teeth before they hear it with their ears. The conductor looks out the window one last time, and he sees the forest disappearing, not falling down, disappearing. The trees are being ripped from the earth, thrown into the air like toothpicks, and behind them, a wall of black debris, a mile wide, is moving toward the tracks. He reaches for the brake, but it is too late. In the next 10 seconds, that 400-ton train will not just be derailed, it will be lifted into the sky. We think we know wind. We have seen the footage of the tri-state tornado. We have watched the devastating outbreaks of 2011 on high-definition video. We have radar on our phones, in our pockets, that tells us exactly where the monster is and exactly when to hide. But this is the story of a time before the warning. The year is 1908. There is no National Weather Service. There is no radar spinning on the horizon. There are no sirens to scream across the towns. If you lived in the Deep South in 1908, your only warning system was your eyes. You looked up. You saw the clouds turning green. You felt the air get heavy and sticky. And if you were lucky, you had maybe 60 seconds to grab your family and pray. This is the story of the Dixie Outbreak. It is a disaster that killed over 300 people in a single day. It erased entire towns from the map. It turned forests into splinters, and threw locomotives like toys. But for some reason, history has forgotten it. We remember the Titanic. We remember the San Francisco earthquake. But the monster that woke up in the Gulf of Mexico on that warm April morning has faded into the silence of the past. Today, we are going to break that silence. We are going to reconstruct the anatomy of a slaughter. We are going to track this storm mile by terrifying mile. Because to understand the future, we have to survive the past. To understand the horror of April 24th, we have to go back 24 hours earlier. April 23rd, the atmosphere over North America is loading a gun. Up north, over the Rocky Mountains, a massive mass of cold, dense air breaks loose. It begins to slide south, heavy and fast. It is hungry for space. At the same time, down in the Gulf of Mexico, the water is warm, unusually warm. It is pumping thousands of tons of moisture into the air, creating a hot, humid soup that drifts northward over Louisiana and Mississippi. These two air masses are enemies. They do not mix. When cold air and it crashes into warm, unstable air, it creates violence. It is simple physics. But on this day, the physics were perfect. By the evening of April 23rd, meteorologists in Washington, D.C. saw the pressure dropping. They saw the barometer falling like a stone. They knew something was wrong. They sent out a telegraph. Severe local storms possible. That was it. Severe local storms. Those 3 words were tapped out in Morse code and sent down the wires to the major cities, New Orleans, Jackson, Birmingham. But here's the tragic reality of 1908. Most people did not live in the cities. They lived in wooden shacks, deep in the pine forests. They were sharecroppers, farmers, lumberjacks. They did not have telegraph machines in their living rooms. They did not have radios. They went to bed on the night of April 23rd, listening to the crickets. They had no idea that 500 miles away, the sky was turning black, the gun was loaded, and the trigger was about to be pulled. Friday, April 24th. The sun rises over Louisiana. It is a strange morning. Ask any survivor, and they will tell you about the air. It felt heavy. It was hot. Oppressively hot for April. The kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin the moment you step outside. In the town of Amite, Louisiana, the day began like any other. Shopkeepers opened their doors, farmers hitched their mules to their plows, children walked to school, swinging their lunch pails, kicking up dust on the dirt roads. But there was a feeling. Animals knew it first. Reports from that morning say that the birds simply stopped singing. Dogs hid under porches and refused to come out. Cows huddled together in the corners of pastures, lowing softly, staring toward the southwest. They sensed the pressure drop. They felt the vibration in the ground. At 10 both a.m., the sky began to change. It didn't just get cloudy. A sheet of white, distinctive. Cirrus clouds spread out high in the atmosphere. An anvil. To a modern storm chaser, seeing an anvil cloud spreading that fast is a sign to run. It means the updraft. The engine of the storm is explosive, but the people of Amite just saw clouds. They wiped the sweat from their foreheads, looked up, and thought, maybe we'll get some rain today. They had no idea. 50 miles to the west, the first supercell had already been born. It was a towering monster, reaching 50,000 feet into the atmosphere. It was spinning, it was breathing, and it was hungry. 11:45 a.m. People are sitting down for lunch. In the distance, to the southwest, there is a noise. At first, it sounds like a train. This is the most common description of a tornado, a freight train. But survivors of the 1908 outbreak say it was different. They say it sounded like a million bees, a humming, vibrating drone that got louder and louder until it became a scream. The storm crossed the Tickfall River. It ripped through the pine forests, snapping trees at the base. These were not small trees. These were ancient pines, 2 feet thick. The wind didn't just blow them over. It twisted them. It shattered them into millions of deadly projectiles. And then it emerged from the woods, and it saw the town of Amite. There was no siren, no warning, just the sudden, shocking realization that the black wall moving toward them was not rain. It was the earth itself being ground up. The impact was absolute. Houses in 1908 were not built with anchor bolts. They sat on brick piers. When the wind hit them, they didn't explode. They slid. They were pushed off their foundations. And then they were pulverized. One survivor, a young man working in a field, watched as his neighbor's house was lifted bodily into the air. He said it spun, slowly, like a top, before disintegrating into a cloud of boards and furniture. Inside that house was a family of 5. In 2 minutes, the town of Amite was changed forever. The tornado cut a path, half a mile wide. It was a grinder. It scrubbed the ground clean. Where there had been homes, gardens, fences, there was now only mud. 29 people died in those 2 minutes. 29, but the storm was not done. It was just getting started. News of the disaster and All Might tried to get out. The telegraph operator in a nearby station frantically tapped out a message. Amite destroyed. Send help. Many dead. The message went down the line. It reached New Orleans. It reached Jackson. But here is the terrifying part. The storm was moving faster than the rescue teams. This supercell, this rotating column of death, was moving northeast at 60 miles per hour. Do you understand how fast that is? A car in 1908 could barely go 30. You could not outrun this storm. You could not drive away from it. If you were in its path, it was coming for you. And it was coming twice as fast as you could move. The storm crossed the state line. It jumped from Louisiana into Mississippi. and as it crossed the Peril River. It did something terrifying. It cycled. Tornadoes usually stay on the ground for a few miles, and then they lift. The energy dissipates, the danger passes. But this storm was a freak of nature. It would lift for a few miles, sparing one town, giving them a false sense of hope, and then it would drop back down, harder, wider, and stronger than before. It was playing a game of Russian roulette with the towns of Mississippi. And the next chamber was loaded for a town called Purvis, Mississippi, a small, quiet lumber town. The geography here is important. Purvis is surrounded by hills and dense, tall pine forests. This is why the South is called Dixie Alley. In the Great Plains, in Kansas or Oklahoma, you can see a tornado coming from 20 miles away. You have a horizon. You have time. In Mississippi, you don't see the tornado. You see trees. You see the forest wall. The tornado hides behind the tree line, cloaked in rain, invisible, until it is right on top of you. It is 2 p.m. The sky over Purvis turns that same sickly, green-black color. The air pressure drops so low that people's ears pop. It feels like being underwater. At the train station, the station master is busy. He is expecting the northbound train, the Great Northern. It is a heavy train carrying passengers from New Orleans. It is running on schedule. He checks the clock. 2:15 p.m. He steps out onto the platform to check the tracks. The wind is picking up. It whips his coat around his legs. He looks down the tracks toward the south. It is raining so hard, he can barely see the signal lights. He goes back inside. He taps a message on the telegraph. Weather bad, tracks slippery. He receives no reply. He tries again. Checking signal. Is train coming? Silence. The line is dead. He doesn't know it yet. But the line is dead because the poles, 3 miles to the south, have been snapped like matchsticks. The monster is on the ground again. Let's pause for a second. We need to understand what is actually heading toward Purvis. This isn't just wind. When we talk about an F4 tornado, we are talking about wind speeds of over 200 miles per hour, but wind speed numbers are just abstract. They don't tell you the horror. At 200 miles per hour, the air itself becomes a solid object. A piece of straw, a flimsy piece of dry grass, can be driven through a telephone pole like a nail. A wooden plank, a 2x4, becomes a missile that can punch through a brick wall. Sand, simple dirt and sand, moving at that speed, acts like sandpaper. It strips the bark off of trees. It strips the feathers off of chickens. It strips the skin off of human beings. And inside the funnel, the pressure is so low, it creates a vacuum. If you are inside a house and the vacuum hits, the house doesn't just blow down. The difference in pressure makes the house expand, explosively. It bursts. From the inside out. This is the physics of hell. And at 2:30 p.m., this physics engine, this grinder, steered itself directly toward the Purvis rail yard. 2:33 p.m. The train whistle blows. The Great Northern pulls into the station. Brakes squeal. Steam hisses. The train is huge, a line of heavy wooden boxcars, followed by passenger coaches. There are over 100 people on board. Some are sleeping. Some are reading newspapers. They complain about the rain lashing against the windows. They are annoyed by the delay. They just want to get home. On the platform, a few people are waiting to board. They are holding umbrellas, struggling against the gusts. Then, the hail starts. Not small hail. Stones the size of baseballs. They smash onto the metal roof of the train. Deafeningly loud. Bang, bang, bang. The passengers jump. Children start to cry. And then, the hail stops. Abruptly. The rain stops. The wind stops. It is the most terrifying moment in a storm. The 0 point. The breath. Before the scream. Total silence. A passenger looks out the window. He sees a black cloud touching the ground, emerging from the forest. It is not moving left. It is not moving right. That means It is coming, straight, for him. He screams, "Get down!" But you cannot hide from this. You are in a wooden box, sitting on a metal track, directly in the path of a force that can move mountains. The roar returns, and this time, it is the sound of the end of the world. The station master watches from the office window. He sees the massive locomotive, the engine itself, shudder. The steel wheels lift 1 inch off the track, then 2 inches, then chaos. It took 45 seconds. 45 seconds. That is all it took to turn the town of Purvis into a graveyard. The tornado slammed into the train with the force of a bomb. It didn't just push the train over, it threw it. Boxcars were tossed 80 feet into the air. They tumbled like dice. They smashed into the depot, flattening the building instantly. The passenger cars, filled with people, were ripped from the tracks and hurled into a nearby swamp. Wooden splinters, glass, mud, and steel churned in a blender of violence. And then, the storm moved on. It raced away to the northeast, looking for its next victim, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and darker than the storm itself. In the wreckage of the train, there was no movement. Not at first. Just the sound of steam, hissing from the broken engine, and the sound of rain, falling on the dead. 55 people died in Purvis alone. Most of them never even knew what hit them. But the nightmare of the Dixie outbreak wasn't over. The sun was starting to go down, and as darkness fell over Alabama and Georgia, the storms did not stop. They just became invisible. Let's go back to the moment the roaring stopped. Purvis, Mississippi, 2:37 p.m. The physics of a disaster are strange. When an F4 tornado passes, it creates a vacuum. It sucks the air out of the room. And then, as it leaves, the air rushes back in. It creates a pressure wave that hits you in the chest. And then, silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. For the survivors inside the train wreckage, the first sensation wasn't pain, it was confusion. The human brain cannot process the idea that a 400-ton train has been thrown into the air. It defies logic. It defies gravity. So, when the passengers opened their eyes, they didn't understand what they were seeing. They saw the sky where the roof should be. They saw the roots of trees instead of the passing forest. They saw the swamp water rising around their ankles. And then, the sounds began to return. First, the hissing. The locomotive engine, that massive boiler of pressurized steam, had been cracked open. It was lying on its side, buried in the mud, screaming as the steam escaped. It sounded like a dying beast. The steam was scalding hot. It drifted over the wreckage in a white fog, mixing with the cold rain, creating a ghostly, blinding mist. And inside that mist, the voices started. At first, just a whimper, a cough, then a name. Sarah? Mama? And then the screaming. It wasn't just the passengers, it was the town itself. The tornado had taken the train and used it as a weapon against the town. Boxcars had been thrown into storefronts. Wheels had been thrown into bedrooms. The station master, who we saw moments ago tapping on the telegraph, was gone. His office was gone. The platform was gone. There was only a flat, muddy scar where civilization used to be. One survivor, a man named Mr. Powell, crawled out of the debris of the passenger car. He was covered in mud. His clothes were shredded. He stood up and looked for the town of Purvis. He later said, "I looked for the buildings. I looked for the landmarks, but there was nothing to see." It was as if the earth had been scraped clean by a giant iron blade. He began to walk. He walked past the twisted rails, which were bent into shapes that looked like pretzels. He walked past the lumberyard, which was now just a million lethal splinters scattered across the ground. He walked toward where the houses used to be, and that is when he saw the true horror of the Dixie outbreak. It wasn't just the destruction of property. It was the silence of the people who couldn't scream. Imagine being a doctor. In 1908, Dr. S.E. Reese was one of the first on the scene. He didn't have an ambulance. He didn't have a team of paramedics. He grabbed his bag, he grabbed his coat, and he ran into the rain. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The injuries caused by a tornado are specific. They are violent. In a car crash, you have blunt force trauma. In a tornado, you have velocity. The wind turns everything into a missile. Dr. Reese found men with pieces of straw, driven deep into their skin. He found women with shards of glass, embedded in their eyes. He found children who had been lifted by the wind and thrown hundreds of yards into the tops of the pine trees. They were hanging there, limp like rag dolls, in the branches of the shattered forest. The doctor had to make a choice, a terrible, impossible choice. Triage. He had to look at a dying man and decide, I cannot save you. He had to walk past the ones who were screaming, to help the ones who were silent, because the silent ones were the ones suffocating. He worked in the mud. He worked in the rain. He used whiskey to clean wounds, because the clean water pipes were destroyed. He used shirts, torn into strips, as tourniquets. He used a door, ripped from a house, as an operating table. And all the while, the rain kept falling. The temperature began to drop. The survivors, wet, shocked, and bleeding, began to shiver. Hypothermia set in. People who had survived the impact of the wind were now dying of exposure in the ruins of their own town. And they were alone. Remember, the telegraph lines were dead. No one knew they were there. 50 miles away, in Hattiesburg, people were eating dinner. They were laughing. They were safe. They had no idea that just down the road, hell had touched the earth. Information in 1908 moved at the speed of a wire, but when the wire is snapped, information moves at the speed of a horse. It took hours for the outside world to realize that Purvis was gone. A railroad brakeman who had survived the crash stumbled down the tracks. He walked for miles, bleeding, limping, until he reached the next signal station that was still standing. He collapsed through the door. He looked at the operator and gasped out 3 words. The train is gone. The operator didn't believe him. Gone? You mean derailed? No, the brakeman whispered. Gone. The wind took it. The operator tapped out the message to New Orleans. Great Northern Number 4 destroyed. Send relief train. Send doctors. Send coffins. Send coffins. That was the request. Not blankets, not food, coffins. When the relief train finally arrived, late that night, the crew was sickened by what they saw. They had to use shovels to clear the tracks of debris just to get the engine close enough to the town. They used the headlights of the locomotive to illuminate the wreckage, and in that harsh, artificial beam of light, the survivors emerged from the darkness. They looked like ghosts, covered in gray mud, eyes wide, trembling. They walked toward the light, toward the warmth of the engine, but not everyone walked. The relief crew began to load the bodies. They stacked them in the boxcars, one by one, men, women, children. The train that had come to save them became a hearse. While Purvis was bleeding, the monster was moving. It is a cruel fact of meteorology that a storm system does not care about the destruction it leaves behind. It consumes energy. It spins. It moves. The supercell crossed the state line into Alabama, and as it crossed, the sun went down. Now, we enter the phase of the outbreak that is pure, psychological terror. Night tornadoes. In 2024, a night tornado is scary. But we have radar. We have lightning flashes on our phone screens. In 1908, a night tornado was invisible death. Imagine you are a farmer in Bergamot, Alabama. It is 8 p.m. It is pitch black outside. There is no moon. The clouds have choked out the stars. You are sitting in your wooden cabin. You have a single kerosene lamp burning on the table. You hear the wind howling outside. But wind is normal. Storms happen. You tell your children to go to sleep. You tell your wife it is just a spring thunderstorm. But then, the dog starts to bark. not a normal bark, a panicked, high-pitched yelp. The dog scratches at the floorboards, trying to dig, trying to get under the house. You feel the pressure change in your ears. It feels like you are diving into deep water. Pop, pop. The flame in the kerosene lamp flickers. It turns blue. And then it goes out. You are in total darkness. And then you hear it. The roar. It is coming from the southwest. It sounds like a waterfall, a massive, crashing waterfall, getting closer and closer. You stand up. You knock over your chair. "Get down!" you scream. But where? There is no basement. This is Alabama. The water table is too high for basements. You are in a wooden box, sitting on brick piers. You grab your family. You huddle in the center of the room. You hold them tight. And you wait. You wait for the monster to decide if you live or if you die. The storm struck Bergamot at 8:30 p.m. It struck Albertville later in the night. Because it was dark, no one saw the funnel. They didn't see the classic Wizard of Oz tornado. What they saw when the lightning flashed was a wall, a solid, black wall of rain and debris. That took up the entire sky. The impact in Alabama was different than in Mississippi. In Mississippi, it hit a train. In Alabama, it hit families. It hit the sleeping. Entire households were asleep in their beds when the roof was ripped off. Think about the violence of waking up, not to an alarm clock, but to the wind tearing your walls apart. One survivor, a young girl, described waking up in the wet grass, a quarter of a mile from her house. She didn't remember the wind. She didn't remember flying. She just went to sleep in her bed and woke up in a field, surrounded by the pieces of her life. Her house was gone. Her parents were gone. She sat there, in the dark, in the rain, calling for them. But the wind drowned out her voice. The death toll in Alabama began to climb. 10, 20, 30, and just like in Mississippi, the rescue efforts were hampered by the dark. Neighbors couldn't help neighbors because they couldn't see them. They had to wait for dawn. They had to sit in the wreckage, shivering, bleeding, praying for the sun to rise. That night, the longest night of their lives, seemed like it would never end. Now, we need to have a difficult conversation. We need to talk about the numbers. If you look at the official records, the National Weather Service lists the death toll at 324. That is a tragedy. But the truth is likely much worse. In 1908, the Deep South was a place of rigid, brutal segregation. There were white towns, and there were black settlements. The white victims, the merchants, the landowners, the passengers on the train were counted. Their names were printed in the newspapers. Their funerals were held in the churches. But the black victims, the sharecroppers who lived in the shanties on the edge of the cotton fields, the laborers who worked in the turpentine camps deep in the woods, they were ghosts to the official record. When the storm passed, and the sheriff came through to count the dead, he often didn't go into the woods. He didn't check the remote cabins. Newspaper reports from the time contained chilling phrases. Several Negroes reported missing. Unknown number of colored farmhands killed. Unknown. They were people. They were fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. But in the eyes of the 1908 bureaucracy, they were just unknown. Historians who have studied the census records and the oral histories of the families in these areas believe that hundreds of people were simply buried where they were found. No coroner, no death certificate, no marker. They were buried in mass graves or in the family plots behind their ruined cabins. So, when we say 324 died, we are lying. The true number, the real cost of the Dixie outbreak, likely exceeds 500, maybe 600. We will never know. The storm erased the evidence, and history erased the memory. By Saturday morning, the story had reached the North. The newspapers in New York and Chicago smelled blood. This was the era of yellow journalism, sensationalism. They printed headlines that were designed to shock. A town wiped from the earth. The finger of God strikes Mississippi. They sent reporters down on the first trains available. But these reporters, they weren't meteorologists. They were storytellers. They walked through the ruins of Purvis, and they looked for the most gruesome, the most shocking details they could find. They wrote about the freak accidents. They wrote about a straw driven through a tree. They wrote about a baby found alive in a dresser drawer, 3 miles from its home. They focused on the spectacle, but they missed the science. They didn't ask, why did this happen? They didn't ask, how can we predict this? They treated the tornado like a monster in a horror movie, a supernatural beast that could not be understood, only feared. And because of this, the lesson was lost. Instead of investing in weather research, instead of building a warning system, the country just gasped, shook its head, and turned the page. They treated it as an act of God. And if it's an act of God, there's nothing you can do about it. So, nothing changed. The telegraph lines were fixed. The houses were rebuilt, exactly as they were before. And the people went back to sleep, blind, deaf, and vulnerable, waiting for the next time the sky turned green. It wasn't until decades later that we really started to understand what happened. In the 1970s and the 1990s, meteorologists went back to the archives. They dusted off the old photographs. They read the survivor diaries. They analyzed the path of the destruction. They wanted to know. What was this thing? Was it one tornado? In 1908, they thought it was one single storm that traveled for 1,000 miles. But modern science tells us that's impossible. We now know it was a family of tornadoes, a cyclic supercell, just like the storms that hit Tuscaloosa in 2011. Just like the storms that hit Mayfield in 2021. The Amite Pine Purvis tornado was likely on the ground for 150 miles. Do you know how rare that is? Most tornadoes last 10 minutes. This one lasted hours. And the rating? The damage to the train offers the biggest clue. Engineers have calculated the force required to lift a locomotive. To tip it over, that takes 100-mile-per-hour winds. To roll it, maybe 150. But to lift it, to throw it through the air, you need wind speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. That puts the Purvis tornado in the rarest category of all, violent, catastrophic. F5. It is a label we don't use lightly. F5 means total destruction. It means incredible phenomena. It means that for a few minutes, on that Friday afternoon, the atmosphere over Mississippi contained the most violent wind on planet Earth. Nature has a way of healing, but it also has a way of remembering. If you fly over the path of the Dixie outbreak today, you can't see the ruined houses. They are gone. But if you talk to the foresters, they will point something out to you. They call it the storm track. In the middle of the old-growth forest, there is a strip of land, about half a mile wide, where the trees are younger, where the ancient pines were snapped. New trees grew back. It is a scar of green, running through the heart of the South, a living monument to the violence of 1908. And there are other scars, in the cemeteries of Purvis and Amite and Bergamot. There are rows of headstones that all share the same date, April 24th, 1908. Entire families, lying side by side. The Miller family, the Johnson family, the unknown. These stones are weathered now. Moss covers the names. People walk past them every day without looking. But we should look. We should look. Because these people were the canaries in the coal mine. They were the victims of a time before technology, a time before warnings. They paid the price for our lack of knowledge. Today, when a supercell forms over Mississippi, things are different. Satellites in space track the moisture. Radar domes scan the clouds. Seeing the rotation before the funnel even drops. Sirens wail across the counties. Phones buzz in our pockets. Tornado warning, take shelter. We have minutes. Sometimes we have an hour. We complain about the noise. We complain about the interruption to our TV shows. But we shouldn't complain. We should be grateful, because that noise, that siren, is the sound of survival. It is the sound that the people of Purvis didn't have. It is the sound that the passengers on the Great Northern Train never heard. The 1908 Dixie outbreak taught us a cruel lesson. It taught us that we cannot trust the silence. It taught us that the sky is beautiful, but it is not our friend. It is a chaotic, violent force. And while we have built better walls and better radars, the wind is still the same. The wind that blew in 1908 is the same wind that blows today. It is still out there, waiting, loading the gun. The story of the Dixie outbreak is a reminder of how fragile we are, but it is just one chapter in the Book of Storms. We have uncovered files on the 1925 tri-state tornado. We have found new evidence on the 1974 super outbreak. We are going to tell those stories, and we are going to tell them with the respect and the detail they deserve.